After her mother passed, I worked double shifts to cover her tuition. I gave up vacations, sold my motorcycle, even delayed my retirement. I showed up at every parent-teacher conference, sat in the waiting room for every checkup, every meltdown, every crisis. But grief changes people. Kayla blamed me for not saving her mother, for not being more than human. And somewhere along the line, her pain turned into poison, and I became the easy target. But still, I kept trying. I sent her a birthday letter every year, even when they came back. I left voicemails just to say, "I love you," even when I knew she wouldn't listen. I stayed silent when people whispered. I stayed patient when they judged. I waited. That morning, when the phone rang, I almost didn't answer. It was an old number, Deborah, a family friend I hadn't heard from in years. Her voice cracked like an old vinyl record. "Russell, I'm so sorry for your loss." I sat there stunned, the receiver cold against my ear. "What loss?" I asked, heart already thudding. She paused. "Your daughter, she held a memorial. Said you passed last month." We lit candles. People spoke. It was beautiful and heartbreaking. I didn't say a word. I couldn't. My tongue felt like lead. I just sat there, staring at the wall while her words bounced around in my skull like rubber bullets. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was erasure. Kayla didn't just want me gone. She wanted me dead. Dead enough to mourn, dead enough to be pitied, but not real enough to contradict her lies. That night, I opened the drawer where I kept every returned letter, every tuition bill, every medical receipt, every voicemail backup. I looked at the pile, then at the man in the mirror. My hands were shaking. My voice was steady. "If she wants to bury me," I muttered, "she better be ready for the resurrection." And just like that, I started planning to walk into my own funeral. I arrived at the memorial service 10 minutes before it started, parking my truck down the block and walking up the sidewalk with a calm I didn't feel. It was held at St. Matthew's Fellowship Hall, same place we held her mother's service all those years ago. Funny how life loops back around in grotesque little circles. I wore a dark suit I hadn't touched since that very day, dusted off and slightly tight at the shoulders. In my hand, I clutched a leather-bound folder with everything: bank statements, canceled checks, copies of her college tuition payments, the unopened letters I had sent her year after year. Proof. Not of love, maybe, but of effort, of presence. I wasn't there to win hearts. I was there to reclaim mine. I slipped in through the side door and found a seat in the back, behind a row of whispering women in floral dresses. No one noticed me at first. The room was dim, lit by soft yellow bulbs and the occasional flicker of fake candles on the tables. There was a large photo of me, my face in black and white, sitting at the altar like I was already 6 feet under. I almost laughed. The audacity. Then the slideshow began, and I realized this wasn't just a service. It was a production. My life reduced to fragments, narrated by the daughter who wanted me dead. Kayla stood at the front in a navy dress, hair pinned up like a grieving widow. Her voice cracked as she spoke. He was a complicated man, distant, reserved, but still, I loved him, even when he left us. I clenched my jaw. Every word was a scalpel cutting deeper. He missed graduations, birthdays, even Mom's funeral. But I forgive him. The crowd sighed sympathetically. Someone dabbed their eyes with a napkin. And just like that, the myth was complete. I wasn't just absent. I was a ghost who chose not to love. I watched people nod, believe, mourn. I watched my reputation die in real time. The worst part wasn't the lies. It was how easily they were swallowed. A cousin I hadn't seen in years spoke next, telling stories I didn't recognize. He was never there for Kayla, she said. But she turned out stronger because of it. Applause. Another voice chimed in. Then another. They buried me in eulogies written in fiction, and I sat through every one. I wanted to stand. I wanted to shout. But I waited. Waited until the silence settled again and the microphone stood empty. Then I stood. Chairs creaked. A few heads turned. One woman gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Kayla froze mid-step as she walked back to her seat. Her eyes locked on mine, wide and horrified, like she'd seen a ghost after all. I stepped forward slowly, each click of my shoes on the linoleum floor like a nail in the coffin she tried to build for me. My voice didn't shake when I said, "Good afternoon." I wasn't aware I died. But since I'm here, I figure I might as well speak. The air thickened. Murmurs rippled through the crowd like a wave of unease. I reached the podium, placed the folder gently on it, and opened the clasp. I pulled out the first letter, dated 3 years ago, birthday card still inside. This was returned to me. Unopened. I held it up. Here's the next one. And the next. You'll see they span birthdays, Christmases, even anniversaries of her mother's death. I turned to the crowd. I didn't disappear. I was erased. Kayla stood abruptly. This isn't the time, she hissed, voice trembling. You don't belong here. I don't. I asked calm. This is my memorial, isn't it? Gasps followed. A woman near the front burst into tears. Someone muttered, "Is this real?" And still, I continued. I pulled out college tuition receipts. $42, $800 to the University of Delaware. Every semester paid in full by me. I laid down doctor's notes, visitation logs, photographs. This is what a father does, even when his child decides he's not enough. Kayla's voice broke. You abandoned me. No, sweetheart, I said, voice low, steel hard. You abandoned the truth. And then I closed the folder. For a moment, everything stood still. The room, thick with the scent of lilies and old wood polish, was suspended in breathless disbelief. People didn't know whether to be outraged, ashamed, or relieved. All they knew was that the man they had just cried for was standing 3 feet from the altar, very much alive, holding the truth in his weathered hands. I looked across the room and saw faces I'd known for decades, faces that had hugged Kayla, wept with her, judged me in silence. And they all looked as if someone had yanked the floor out from under them. Kayla's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Her lips trembled as if searching for the right tone. Outrage, grief, confusion, but none would stick. I stood there watching her stumble for control, her polished exterior cracking under the weight of exposure. She finally said, "This isn't about you. This was a space for healing." Her voice faltered on the last word, like even she knew how ridiculous it sounded. Healing, after burying someone alive with lies? Healing, when you invite people to mourn a man you deliberately tried to erase. I let out a dry laugh, not loud, but enough. Healing? Kayla, this isn't healing. This is theater. And I'm sorry to interrupt the final act, but the lead character isn't dead. I held up the folder again. You wanted to be seen as the girl who survived abandonment. But the only thing I abandoned was my dignity for too long, trying to reach you. The silence that followed was thick, uneasy. A few people began murmuring, questioning. One elderly aunt shook her head slowly and muttered something I couldn't hear. A younger cousin glanced between us, his brow furrowed. Then Aunt Melanie stood up. God bless that woman, stiff, stubborn, and the only person in the room with a backbone. She was never one for family drama, never picked sides. But her voice rang clear across the fellowship hall. I remember the day you said he didn't care, Kayla. Said he hadn't called. But he was at my house 2 hours before, asking if you were okay. He showed me the letters. I told you that. She turned to the crowd. I didn't know what to believe then, but I sure as hell do now. That broke the dam. A ripple of whispers followed. Someone pulled out their phone, probably recording. Someone else got up and left. I didn't move from the podium. I wasn't there to be cruel. I wasn't there to make Kayla pay, not in the way she made me pay, but I damn sure wasn't going to let the lie win. I turned toward the photo of me at the altar, still glowing under the soft lights. You want to mourn someone? Mourn the father she invented. The one who walked away. The one who forgot her. That man deserves the grave. I paused, then added, but don't confuse him with me. Kayla's eyes were glassy now. Whether from fury or regret, I couldn't tell. Her hands clenched into fists, her voice rising. You think this proves something? You think standing here makes you a better father? You didn't listen when I needed you. You always thought you knew best. Her words were like sparks thrown into a puddle. No fire, just noise. I could have argued. Could have reminded her of the nights I sat up praying for her. The bills I paid without asking for thanks. The years I let her rewrite me into a villain. But I was done arguing. I don't need to prove anything, I said. I lived it. You twisted it. And now we're both standing in the wreckage. I looked around the room again. I didn't come here to beg for understanding. I came to bury the lie. And I brought a shovel full of truth. A few people chuckled nervously. Most were too stunned to speak. I gathered the folder, closed it gently, and looked back at Kayla one last time. You can keep your story, but I'm taking back my name. Then I stepped down. What happened next felt surreal. Some people clapped, awkward, scattered, unsure whether it was appropriate. Others looked away, avoiding eye contact. A few, including old friends I hadn't heard from in years, approached me in hushed tones. I'm sorry, Russ. We didn't know. Man, she really had us convinced. You look good, by the way. Strong. I nodded politely, but inside, I was hollow. This wasn't victory. It was survival. And there's no medal for enduring your own funeral. Outside, the air was cooler than I remembered. I walked to my truck in silence, folder still tucked under my arm, my footsteps echoing on the pavement like punctuation to the last sentence of a story I never asked to be part of. Before I climbed in, I turned around one last time. Kayla had stepped out of the hall, standing on the steps, arms crossed, face unreadable. She didn't come closer. I didn't wave. We just stood there, two strangers linked by blood, staring across the chasm her lies had carved. Then I got in the truck and drove off. I didn't cry. Not then. Not even when I got home and placed the folder back in the drawer. The tears had dried up years ago, when the rejections were quieter, more private. What I felt now was something else. Not triumph. Not grief. Just clarity. For the first time in years, I felt seen, not by them, not even by Kayla, but by myself. I had let her story define me for so long I forgot I had one of my own. And that story didn't end in shame. It ended with a man standing in the middle of his own funeral, alive. Alive and unbroken. The aftermath of that day came not with thunder, but with a slow burn. A silence that was no longer empty, but heavy with consequence. I didn't hear from Kayla, and I didn't expect to. But what surprised me was how fast the truth spread. Like wildfire through dry brush, it traveled from one mouth to another. Whispers turning into calls, calls into confessions. Some of those same relatives who wouldn't look me in the eye at grocery stores were now in my voicemail box, stumbling through apologies, talking in circles like a GPS rerouting after a wrong turn. We didn't know, they all said. If we had known. And I listened to each one in full, then deleted them. Not out of spite, but closure. It wasn't about whether they believed me now. It was about why they didn't before. That's what kept me up some nights, staring at the ceiling fan spinning overhead like a slow-motion clock. Not the betrayal, but the ease of it. How quickly people abandoned their version of me. How nobody thought to question a story that painted me so cruelly. Maybe it made them feel better to think I had turned cold. Maybe it let them off the hook for not reaching out themselves. But whatever the reason, the damage had been done. I had already lived the years they were now sorry for. I went to the hardware store the day after the memorial, just a mundane errand, a new set of pliers and a replacement filter for the HVAC. But even there, I felt it. The clerk behind the counter, a young guy who used to barely nod in my direction, gave me a half smile and said, "You're Kayla's dad, right? That thing last weekend? Man, that was wild." I nodded, didn't say much, just paid and walked out. But it hit me. The story had gone public. Not just family gossip anymore. Social circles were buzzing. People I hadn't spoken to in years were digging into the truth. One afternoon, about a week later, I got a knock on the door. It was Melanie. She brought a casserole dish, like this was some kind of Southern apology ritual. I invited her in, and we sat on the porch like we used to when things made sense. She didn't start with small talk. "She's not doing well," she said, spooning a chunk of tuna noodle onto her plate without looking at me. "Kayla's been blowing up Facebook, crying in videos, saying you ambushed her, that you made her relive trauma." I looked at the sky instead of her. She's not the only one who had to relive something. Melanie nodded slowly. "I know. And for what it's worth, I believe you. I think most of us do now. Doesn't mean we know what to do with it." That was the rub, wasn't it? The truth doesn't come with instructions. It just shows up like an eviction notice and demands you pack up your lies. Kayla didn't expect me to stand up at that podium. She didn't expect to be questioned. Her whole world was built on the sympathy she got from being the daughter of a deadbeat. She wore that narrative like armor, and I took it off her in front of everyone. I didn't feel proud. I felt responsible, not for her actions, but for the years I let her pain fester without confrontation. Maybe I thought time would fix it. Maybe I hoped she'd find her way back on her own. But truth without confrontation is just a secret with good posture. Eventually, it slouches, and I let it slouch too long. Later that night, I sat with the old letters again. Not to read them, just to hold them. There's a peculiar kind of silence that settles after an earthquake, not the kind you hear, but the kind you feel. That was what the week after the memorial felt like. The aftershocks of my truth rippled through every branch of the family tree, shaking loose more than just Kayla's lies. Some people retreated into embarrassed silence. Others tried to reach out with hollow apologies. But I wasn't chasing closure anymore. I'd stood in the eye of the storm and walked out still standing. The rest of them? They could sit in the rubble they helped build. Kayla, of course, didn't vanish. No, she doubled down. Posts popped up every other day, videos of her crying, vague messages about betrayal, captions that read like open wounds. Some people only show up to hurt you again. Just because someone gave you life doesn't mean they know how to love you. Her followers, many of whom didn't even know me, flooded the comments with sympathy. Strangers calling me a narcissist, an abuser, a manipulator. It was surreal watching someone reframe their exposure into another performance. If the first act was the funeral, this was the encore, the martyrdom tour. But it didn't land the same way. People started asking questions in the comments. Didn't your dad show up with proof? What about those letters? Some family members began posting subtle responses. Photos of me holding Kayla as a child, screenshots of texts, even short paragraphs about the Russell they remembered. The tide didn't exactly turn in my favor, but it stopped being a wave against me. And that, honestly, was enough. I wasn't looking to win. I just wanted to stop bleeding. Melanie called again. Said Kayla was losing brand deals. Something about sponsors pulling out, people questioning her truth. Apparently, a podcast she'd been booked on canceled last minute. She's spiraling, Melanie said. You should talk to her. I let the silence sit for a long time. No, I said finally. She lit the match. She can sit in the smoke. Because here's the thing about lies. They have expiration dates. And when you've built your house out of them, every gust of truth is a wrecking ball. I didn't take joy in her downfall. There was no part of me that celebrated her being humiliated or dropped by sponsors. But I wasn't going to save her from the fallout she engineered. If this was what rock bottom looked like for her, maybe it was the only place she could finally stop digging. A few nights later, I was watching the news when my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something in me, some old muscle memory of being a father, made me press accept. Dad, it was barely a whisper. I didn't say anything right away. Just sat there, listening to the static of her breath. I didn't know what else to do, she said. Everyone's turning on me. Still, I waited. Because what do you say to someone who held a funeral for you? I thought, if I told the story, people would understand why I felt hurt. I didn't think it would go this far. You didn't think lying would have consequences? I asked, not harshly, just honestly. She sniffled. You humiliated me. No, Kayla. You humiliated yourself. I just refused to stay buried. There was silence on her end. Then she asked, can we meet? I looked out the window. The yard I used to mow every Saturday. The porch she used to sit on. The driveway where she once learned to ride a bike. Why? I asked. I don't know, she said. To talk. To explain. You already did, I replied. To everyone but me. She didn't fight that. She didn't beg. Just said, okay, and hung up. I stared at the blank screen, wondering if that would be the last conversation we ever had. If it was, I wasn't sure how I felt about that. Relieved? Sad? Empty? Maybe all of it. Maybe none. The next day, Melanie stopped by again. Brought over a pie like it was Thanksgiving. She asked how I was. I said, still breathing. She laughed. Said that was a win. Then she told me something that stuck. She's not the only one grieving, you know. You're grieving the version of her you thought she'd be. And she was right. I was. I still remembered the little girl who clung to my leg in preschool, the teenager who cried in my arms after her first heartbreak, the college student who once texted, "Thanks for everything, Dad. I love you." That girl was gone, replaced by someone who saw love as leverage and lies as legacy. I didn't know how to mourn her, or if I even should. Later that week, I found myself back at the mailbox. No letters this time, just a habit. I looked inside, half expecting another returned envelope. Nothing, just emptiness. But for once, it didn't sting. Emptiness can be peaceful, too, if you stop expecting it to be full. I sat on the porch that night with a cup of black coffee and the cool hum of September air. I thought about everything that had happened. The funeral, the confrontation, the fallout. I thought about how Kayla tried to make me a villain and how I'd let her do it for far too long. I thought about the silence that used to feel like punishment and how it now felt like space. Space to breathe, to exist, to be. The fallout was hers to live with. I had already survived it. Some deaths don't require a body, just a belief. For years, I had walked through this life shadowed by the story Kayla wrote about me, one where I was distant, cold, absent. And in the absence of my voice, that story grew roots. People built their image of me on half-truths and silence, mourning a father who never existed while I sat very much alive in the wreckage. But now, in the weeks after the memorial, something shifted. The version of me Kayla invented had finally died. And with it, the illusion that I needed her permission to be known. The day I buried that ghost for good, the sun was low and gold, casting a warm hue across the grass in my backyard. I had spent the morning organizing old papers. Tax forms, Kayla's college receipts, photographs I didn't know whether to keep or burn. That's when I found it again, the letter I never sent. It was dated 5 years ago, written during a night when I was desperate to reach her, but too proud to call. The envelope was unsealed, the ink a little faded, but the words still cut deep. I read it out loud, just to hear the man I used to be. Kayla, I don't know what story you've told yourself, but I've never stopped loving you. I may not have always said the right thing, but I was there. I've always been there. I hope one day you'll see that. I folded the letter and walked to the fire pit behind my house. I didn't cry. I didn't hesitate. I lit a match, watched the flame touch the corner, and dropped it in. The paper curled and blackened, the smoke rising like a spirit finally set free. That wasn't me anymore, not the man begging to be heard, not the father defined by absence. That was her version of me, and it was time to lay him to rest. The funeral was mine to hold, even if no one showed up. Melanie came by that evening. She didn't say much, just brought a bottle of whiskey and 2 tumblers. We sat on the porch, letting the silence stretch out the way old friends do. She glanced at the empty fire pit and asked, "Did you burn it?" I nodded. She didn't ask which one. She already knew. "Good," she said. "Some things need to die before they kill us." We talked a while, about the family, the mess, the years we couldn't get back. She told me Kayla had stopped posting. No more teary videos. No more vague quotes. Just silence. Whether it was shame or exhaustion, we didn't know. But it was something. I said I hoped she found peace. Not forgiveness. Not even reconciliation. Just peace. Because at the end of it all, that's what I wanted too. A week later, a small package arrived in the mail. No return address, just my name in handwriting I recognized. Inside was a framed photo of us, Kayla, age 10, clinging to my arm at her school science fair. We were both smiling, both happy, both untouched by whatever future would come to tear us apart. No note, no apology, just the image. I stared at it for a long time, not because I missed that moment, but because I finally understood it for what it was, a memory, not a promise. We were both different people now. That little girl was gone, and the man in the photo? He'd been reborn through fire. I didn't call her, didn't write. I placed the photo on a shelf near the entryway, visible, but not prominent. A relic, not a shrine. That was the closest thing we'd have to a reunion, and I was okay with that. Because the truth was, I didn't need to be in her life to be at peace with mine. In the weeks that followed, I found a rhythm again. I repaired the old deck, finally fixed the creaky gate, even rejoined a bowling league I'd left years ago. People saw me now, not just as Kayla's dad, or the man from that strange funeral, but as Russell. Just Russell. The man who didn't disappear. The man who stood up and told the truth when it mattered most. Some family members reached out and stayed consistent. Others ghosted again after their apologies. I let it all be. No chasing. No forcing. Just boundaries. I knew now that silence didn't have to mean shame. Sometimes it meant freedom. Sometimes it meant you finally stopped trying to explain yourself to people who weren't listening in the first place. One Sunday, I visited her mother's grave. The cemetery was quiet, the trees swaying gently in the September breeze. I knelt down, placed a single sunflower, their favorite, and whispered, "I did my part." Then I stood and pulled from my coat pocket a small envelope. Inside were the ashes of the eulogy I had written and burned, the one written not by her, but by me. I laid it beside the flower and let the wind take it, piece by piece. There's something sacred about reclaiming your name, about no longer waiting for someone to rewrite your legacy. I wasn't the perfect father, but I was there. I gave what I had, and when it mattered most, I showed up. That would be my story now. Not because Kayla gave it to me, but because I took it back. She buried a version of me that never existed. But I rose from that grave, stronger, clearer, alive. And now, the only funeral I recognize is the one I held in my backyard, with fire and truth as my witnesses. I am not a man who abandons his family, but I will never hesitate to expose the one who betrayed mine. What would you do if your own child rewrote your story and the world believed them? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. This story isn't just about betrayal. It's about survival, dignity, and standing firm in your truth, even when it feels like no one's listening. If this story moved you, subscribe, like, and share it with someone who needs to remember. The truth doesn't need permission. It just needs to be told. See you soon in the next one.